Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail into the wild, woolly world of Viking hygiene, because nothing says cozy evening storytelling quite like talking about ancient people, scrubbing their armpits with moss and fighting lice with medieval swag. From snot-nosed kids on longships to surprisingly fashionable warriors in fox fur cloaks, Viking cleanliness was a chaotic mix of impressive innovation and deeply questionable choices. So, before we dive into the sweat, smoke, and soap of Norse life, take a second to like the video and subscribe only if you enjoy these deep dives into the weird corners of history. And let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what's your favorite Viking fact or stereotype? Horned helmets are not allowed. We're historically accurate here. Mostly. Now, light a candle, maybe toss on a fleece blanket, and imagine you're huddled in a smoky wooden longhouse in the far north, surrounded by bearded warriors, loud laughter, and the slightly suspicious scent of boiled fish. Because despite their brutal reputation, Vikings weren't just raiders and berserkers. They were also surprisingly clean, kind of. For people who regularly bathed in icy rivers, used ear spoons like pocket jewelry, and carried personal grooming kits into battle, Viking hygiene was equal parts gross, inventive, and weirdly admirable. So let's row through the myths, muck, and marvels together. Grab your metaphorical aura, perhaps a comb carved from antler, and let's journey into a time when being clean meant smelling slightly less awful than your enemies. Imagine being called a filthy barbarian by someone who hasn't bathed since last Lent. That was the situation Vikings found themselves in, smeared across history as unwashed savages who roared out of the north with greasy hair and axes in hand, ready to pillage monasteries and track mud all over the continent. And yet, as is so often the case with stereotypes, the truth is more complicated, more human, and occasionally more embarrassing. Because the Vikings, bless them, were actually kind of obsessed with being clean. No, really. If you were to step into a Viking settlement, say, 9th century Birka, or a bustling homestead near Trondheim, you wouldn't be met by a rank cloud of sweat and sorrow. You'd probably smell wood smoke, sure, and maybe a hint of fish stew that had been sitting on the fire a bit too long. But underneath that, soap, birch, possibly mint, and almost definitely wet wool. Because once a week, every single Saturday, the Norse folk did something shockingly civilized. They bathed. It's easy to assume that cleanliness is a modern luxury, the kind of thing that arrived alongside indoor plumbing and shower gel that smells like alpine glaciers. But the Vikings were miles ahead of most of medieval Europe when it came to basic hygiene. In fact, many Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, those poor monks who tried to survive Viking raids with both their gold and dignity intact, complained that the Norsemen were unfairly popular with the local women. Why? Because they were excessively clean. Yes, excessively. As in, these horrifying Northmen keep washing their hair and trimming their beards, and we just don't think that's fair. You see, the Vikings didn't just tolerate water, they embraced it. Not just for drinking, but for bathing, steaming, sweating, and scrubbing. They knew that if you were going to wear furs, haul timber, chase down wild boar, and occasionally swing a sword at a rival clan, it was probably best not to smell like something the gods forgot in the corner of a longhouse. And so, once a week Logadaga, literally washing day, they did something practically heretical by medieval standards. They got naked and cleaned themselves. But let's not romanticize this too much. Viking hygiene wasn't all eucalyptus steam and polished marble tiles. There was no loofah, no lavender-scented shampoo, and certainly no cucumber eye masks. What they had were wooden tubs, buckets of river water, a solid tolerance for cold, and in some cases, a trip to the hot springs if you were lucky enough to live near one. Iceland, in particular, was a geothermal spa paradise. It wasn't unusual for Viking settlers to take advantage of naturally heated water bubbling up from the earth like a gift from Thor himself. Say what you want about living on a volcanic rock in the middle of the North Atlantic, but at least you could warm your toes. For the inland folk, things required a bit more elbow grease. Water had to be hauled in usually by women, or slaves from streams or wells, and fires had to be lit to warm it. Baths weren't casual indulgences, they were projects, but they were also social events. Bathing was communal, which meant you didn't just get clean, you caught up on gossip, made plans, negotiated marriages, or plotted the next trip to raid Northumbria. There's something inherently charming, and also slightly terrifying, about imagining a group of Viking men scrubbing their feet while arguing about the best route to pillage a monastery. And this wasn't just for the elite. The idea that only nobles could afford to be clean was common in much of Europe, but the Vikings, being a bit more egalitarian in their dirt management, made cleanliness a cultural norm. Even the average farmer took part in washing day, dragging out the wooden tubs and pouring hot water with all the enthusiasm of someone determined not to smell like his goats. Of course, bathing wasn't just about appearances. In a world before antibiotics and deodorant, hygiene had serious consequences. Infections could kill you, lice could drive you mad, and let's be honest, if you've ever worn a wool tunic for more than 20 minutes, you'll understand the urgent need for personal maintenance. So Vikings turned to what they had: ash-based soap, sharp knives for shaving, combs made from antler or bone, and the kind of weekly rinse that made the rest of medieval Europe look like a walking petri dish. Their soap, by the way, was no joke. It was homemade and brutally effective, a mix of animal fat and wood ash that could cut through grime like a Viking through a monastery door. It was alkaline, abrasive, and often doubled as shampoo. If your hair was squeaky after a wash, that wasn't a metaphor. It probably squeaked. The Norse took special pride in their hair, braiding it, oiling it, and keeping it trimmed, even while living in drafty huts surrounded by livestock and existential dread. And this is where the irony really starts to bite. Because while Viking hygiene may seem primitive to us now, it was light years ahead of what was happening in, say, 11th century Paris, where the average person might wash once a year if they were feeling particularly festive. Public bathhouses in most of Christian Europe had been shut down due to concerns about nudity, temptation, and the idea that cleanliness was somehow sinful. Dirt, it was thought, kept you humble. The Vikings? Not so much. They figured if you were going to face death in battle, you might as well do it looking decent and not smelling like the inside of a tunic armpit. And that vanity extended beyond the bathhouse. Viking graves often include combs, tweezers, and razor-small, personal grooming kits meant to accompany you into the afterlife. Because clearly, even in Valhalla, you shouldn't show up with untrimmed nose hair. These tools weren't just practical, they were symbolic. Carrying a comb wasn't just about detangling your locks. It marked you as civilized, as someone who took pride in your appearance, as someone who, even while covered in blood and mud, still had standards. It's hard not to admire the cognitive dissonance. Here were people who could set your house on fire, loot your village, and still pause mid-pillage to braid their beards and moisturize with animal fat. That's not filth, that's focus. Of course, not everything about Viking hygiene was charming. Their homes, for example, were not exactly sanitary marvels. Longhouses were smoky, crowded, and featured central hearths that belched soot into every crevice. Ventilation was limited, lighting was mostly by fire, and, if you were hoping for a bit of fresh air, your options were walk outside into the blizzard, or open the door and let the chickens out. Most families shared space with animals during winter, and while this added warmth, it also meant that your living room occasionally moved. Still, even in these close quarters, the emphasis on personal grooming persisted. Parents combed their children's hair daily, both for vanity and to fight the endless war against lice. Women washed clothing in icy rivers, using ash, soap, and sheer willpower. And everyone, it seems, took part in the small rituals of cleanliness that defined Viking life, scraping the dirt from under their nails, rinsing their faces with cold water, and chewing on birch twigs to keep their teeth clean. and breath vaguely bearable. In the end, Viking hygiene wasn't about luxury. It was about practicality, pride, and a little bit of flair. These were people who understood that cleanliness wasn't just about looking good, it was about surviving better. A clean warrior was a healthier warrior. A man with tidy hair was more likely to get a wifer, at least avoid lice long enough to propose. Clean clothes, even if soaked in smoke and salt, still meant something. And in a world of frostbite, backstabbing politics, and sudden axe wounds, that little bit of control mattered. So the next time you imagine a Viking, don't just picture the blood and beards. Picture a man holding a bone comb, meticulously straightening his hair before battle. Picture a woman boiling water over a fire, ready for Saturday bath night. Picture a group of warriors lounging in a steamy hut, arguing about ship routes, while someone throws juniper branches on the fire for that extra herbal scent. Because Viking hygiene, it wasn't gross, it wasn't savage, it was, in its own gritty, practical way, deeply human. And yes, kind of impressive, even if they did sometimes forget to clean under their fingernails. If you've ever rolled your eyes at someone who pulls a mirror and a travel-size grooming kit out of their bag at a coffee shop, allow us to introduce you to the Viking history's original believers in on-the-go personal care. Because long before minimalist influencers started flexing their tiny toiletry bags, the Norse were strapping tweezers, ear spoons, and lice combs to their belts, like it was the height of everyday fashion. And in a way, it kind of was. We tend to think of Vikings as mud-smeared, fur-covered berserkers who grunted their way through life, too busy raiding monasteries to notice they had chicken feathers stuck in their beards. But crack open a burial mound or peek inside the toolkit of your average Norseman, and you'll find a rather different story, one filled with surprising delicacy, deliberate grooming, and a war on lice that was nothing short of heroic. To understand Viking hygiene tools, you first have to understand the fundamental truth of Viking life. It was deeply uncomfortable. Cold, smoky, crowded, damp. Everything about it was a full-time sensory assault. But rather than give in to the general entropy of the world, the Vikings doubled down on order where they could. And for many, that order came in the form of grooming accessories small enough to fit on a keychain, but important enough to accompany them into the afterlife. Let's start with the lice comb, which is exactly what it sounds like. A finely toothed implement designed to drag tiny parasites out of your scalp and into the light of day. These weren't casual items you tossed in a drawer either. Made from bone, antler, or wood, these combs were carved with as much care as some weapons. Some even folded into protective cases like precious instruments, suggesting that delousing was not just a necessity, it was practically a ritual. Imagine sitting by the hearth in your longhouse, comb in hand, casually chatting about the upcoming harvest, while running a bone rake through your hair in hopes of catching a few stowaways. And you would have stowaways. Lice, fleas, and their merry band of microscopic comrades were not occasional visitors, they were roommates. Longhouses were heated with central hearths and insulated with wool, skins, and human breath. Clothes were worn often and washed rarely. Bedding might consist of straw, fur, and the memories of last year's hay fever. And since family members, visitors, and the odd chicken often shared the same airspace, it didn't take long for lice to set up shop and start charging rent. So Vikings fought back with the best tools they could make. The comb wasn't optional, it was survival gear, and it wasn't just for appearances. Head lice, if left unchecked, could lead to infections, scabs, and a sense of itchy despair that probably made even the most hardened warrior cry a little on the inside. A clean head was not only more comfortable, it was part of being a respectable human being in a world where that was increasingly hard to manage. And speaking of hard to manage, let's talk about the ear spoon. If you're imagining a tiny utensil designed to scoop something unpleasant out of somewhere uncomfortable, congratulations, you're exactly right. Ear spoons were slim, spatula-like tools, usually carved from bone or metal, used to scrape earwax from the inner recesses of the Viking auditory system. There were no cotton swabs, no gentle rinses, no "don't put anything smaller than your elbow" safety lectures, just a curved tool and a grim sense of duty. Now, we may laugh at the idea of someone cleaning their ears with a carved bit of reindeer, but the ear spoon was a prized possession. Archaeologists have found them in graves, sometimes attached to elaborate toiletry sets that hung from belts like a janitor's keychain of personal upkeep. These sets might include tweezers, nail cleaners, and sometimes even little toothpicks. Because if you're going to die in battle, by Odin, you're not going to show up in Valhalla with dirty fingernails and gunk-filled ears. And yes, tweezers, small, elegant tools that look startlingly modern, used for plucking facial hair, removing splinters, and perhaps fending off the creeping advance of unibrows. Personal grooming, for the Vikings, wasn't some frivolous pastime. It was a way to assert control over your body in a world that could, at any moment, club you over the head and steal your goat. Every small act of self-care was a form of defiance against lice, against dirt, and against the slow erosion of civility by the daily grind of smoke, sweat, and stew. These grooming kits weren't hidden away in secret. They were worn openly, often dangling from belts in pouches or chains. Imagine striding into a feast hall, your axe on one hip, your grooming set on the other, ready for battle or beard maintenance, whichever came first. In a society that valued strength and appearance in equal measure, personal care was a marker of status. A man who carried tweezers wasn't vain, he was meticulous. A woman who scraped her ears and combed her hair with carved antler was not obsessed with beauty, she was civilized. And this wasn't just a domestic affair. Vikings took their grooming on the road. Longship journeys were cramped, dangerous, and exposed to the elements, but that didn't mean you abandoned basic standards. It's not hard to imagine a warrior crouched on a riverbank in Mercia, washing his face with cold water, carefully combing his hair, and then storming a nearby village. Pillage, rinse, repeat. There's even evidence that combs and other grooming tools were traded widely across the Viking world. They've been found not just in Scandinavia, but across the British Isles, in Eastern Europe, and even as far as Byzantium. A comb, it turns out, travels well. And when you're half a continent away from your longhouse, sleeping under your boat and eating dried fish, a small, familiar tool that helps you feel human again is worth its weight in silver. To modern eyes, the presence of these tools might seem quaint, even comedic. It's hard not to smirk at the idea of a battle-hardened Norseman plucking his eyebrows or scraping wax from his ears with a spoon. But then again, maybe the joke's on us. Because while medieval Europe was busy pretending that bathing was suspicious and personal hygiene was a sign of vanity, the Vikings were dealing with their problems head-on literally. They couldn't afford to ignore the practical side of bodily maintenance. You want to wield a sword effectively? Don't get an infection. Want to keep morale up on a 6-month voyage to raid the Frankish coast? Don't let everyone get fleas. Even the Sagasthos sprawling, semi-mythical epics that blend history with just enough creative exaggeration to make things spicy mention grooming. Heroes were described by their shining hair, their clean faces, their well-kept clothes. To be unkempt was to be uncivilized, even shameful. You could be violent, sure. You could be terrifying in battle, absolutely. But you could not, under any circumstances, be unkempt. And let's not overlook the emotional component. In a world that was constantly trying to kill you, whether via storm, sword, starvation, or simply your cousin Bjorn's questionable mushroom stew, small routines offered comfort. A comb in your hand was a tiny piece of predictability, something solid, something familiar, something that didn't argue with you about land rights or try to steal your cattle. In a longhouse filled with tension and testosterone, a quiet moment with a grooming kit might have been the closest thing to therapy. It's worth noting, too, that these grooming habits weren't gender exclusive. Viking women were just as concerned with cleanliness and appearance as their male counterparts, perhaps even more so, since they also had to manage the general cleanliness of the household, the children, and any visiting relatives who seemed to have forgotten what a bath was. Women combed their hair daily, braided it carefully, and likely spent more time than they cared to admit dealing with lice. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary, and they did it with tools that were thoughtfully made, often beautifully carved, and deeply personal. These small implements of self-care, humble as they may seem, tell us more about the Vikings than any runestone or battle axe ever could. They reveal a people who valued appearance, not out of vanity, but out of discipline. A culture where grooming wasn't a luxury, it was a responsibility. And in a society built on both survival and status, something as small as a comb could mean the difference between being seen as a leader or being laughed out of the feast hall. So no, lice combs, tweezers, and bone ear spoons aren't exactly glamorous. You won't find them in epic paintings or heroic statues. But they were part of daily life, used with intention, pride, and just the right amount of self-respect. And when you picture a Viking now, don't just imagine the blood and the braids. Picture the quiet moment before battle, when someone sat by the fire, plucked a louse from their beard, and thought, "Not today, you little bastard." Because dignity, like grooming, is a daily decision, and the Vikings, for all their chaos, made it one comb stroke at a time. If you've ever judged someone for clipping their nails on a bus, congratulations, you would have fit right in at a Viking feast. Because for a people remembered mostly for their war cries and beard braids, the Norse had a surprisingly enthusiastic relationship with grooming, and not the splash your face and hope for the best kind. No, the Vikings carried full-on toiletry, kits carefully carved, often decorative sets of tools, dangling from their belts, like medieval Swiss Army knives of personal upkeep. You weren't just a warrior. You were a warrior who flossed. This, of course, doesn't quite match the image we usually have of Vikings mud-flecked raiders, with axes in hand and who knows what in their beards. But history, as usual, is more complicated than its caricatures. The same hands that gripped sword hilts also gripped tweezers. The same men who crossed stormy seas also carried bone combs. And while their hygiene standards didn't exactly scream spa day, the fact remains, Vikings took grooming seriously. Maybe not scented candle and loofah seriously, but enough to bring nail cleaners to a battle. And that's where things get interesting. Let's begin with the visual. Imagine a Norseman broad-shouldered, fur-cloaked, beard, thick enough to lose small animals in. Around his waist, hanging from a leather strap, is not just a knife or pouch of coins, but a miniature collection of tools, a comb made of antler, a slender ear spoon, a pair of surprisingly elegant tweezers. This isn't just function, it's form, a declaration, like a Rolex, but for removing parasites. These grooming kits were often housed in ornately carved cases, sometimes with decorative motifs, knotwork, animal forms, or runes etched in with precision. If you're picturing something slapped together in a hurry, don't. This wasn't an afterthought. These kits had aesthetic weight. They were personal items, status markers, and if grave goods are anything to go by, possessions so important, they were taken into the afterlife. You can't take your cattle to Valhalla, but apparently you can take your earwax scraper. So what was in this divine toiletry arsenal? First and foremost, the comb. No Viking kit was complete without one. These combs were carved from antler or bone, usually with very fine teeth. Their job was simple and heroic, to wage eternal war against lice, and not just head lice, body lice, beard lice, the kind of lice you don't even want to imagine, but which, unfortunately, thrived in smoky, crowded longhouses with minimal ventilation and an open-door policy for livestock. A good comb wasn't a luxury, it was a weapon. Archaeologists have found so many lice combs in Viking settlements that it's clear these weren't niche items. Everyone had one, and if they didn't, they borrowed one, hopefully, before it was too late. Now, lice combs weren't tossed into drawers or hidden in pouches. They were proudly carried, often in little cases or boxes that protected the teeth and advertised your hygiene credentials. Think of it as a business card, but for someone who wants you to know they don't have fleas. There's a kind of intimacy in these tools. They were used daily, often in social settings. Picture a family gathered around a fire, each person gently raking through their hair, chatting about crops or who stole whose fishing net, all while scraping out yesterday's hitchhikers. And then there were tweezers, thin, delicate, and made of bronze, iron, or bone. Their exact uses varied. Some were for plucking facial hair, others for pulling out splinters or dealing with minor skin issues. In a time before antiseptic or decent lighting, tweezers were your first line of defense against infections and injuries that might otherwise escalate into something more medieval. They were especially useful on the road. If you're halfway to Dublin with a piece of pine embedded in your palm, your choice is either suffer quietly or whip out your belt-hanging tweezer and get to work. Vikings didn't just carry tweezers, they displayed them. They were usually attached to grooming sets via rings or cords, swinging gently at one's side, like a dangling reminder of personal standards. They might clink softly as you walked, which, if you think about it, is a very specific kind of flex. Not, I'm rich, or I'm armed, but I am clean. The ear spoon, of course, continues to be the most debated tool in the Norse grooming lexicon. Usually a thin rod with a curved scoop at one end, this delightful implement was designed for cleaning out earwaxer, necessary evil, in a world where longhouses were basically smoke chambers with goats. You'd think spending your days shouting over wind, waves, and other people would be enough to keep your ears clear, but no, earwax had its own plans, and the Vikings responded with elegance. Ear spoons were as common as combs, and many were crafted with the same level of detail and pride. After all, if you're going to invade a kingdom, best to hear their cries of panic clearly. Sometimes, these tools were grouped together on a single ring. Other times, they were stored in matching cases. But the effect was the same. Personal grooming, Viking style, was mobile, accessible, and extremely visible. You didn't tuck these away like embarrassing secrets. You wore them like a declaration of civilization. Clean ears, clean fingernails, tamed beard now. That's how you conquer a continent. To put this in perspective, remember that many of the people Vikings raided thought bathing was morally suspect. Christian Europe, particularly in the earlier centuries of the Middle Ages, had developed a mild panic around nudity and pleasure, both of which were suspiciously present in the act of washing. Bathhouses were shuttered, monks swore off soap, and the average noble might go months between washes. In that environment, Vikings must have seemed downright decadent, lice-free, and freshly combed. In this economy, no wonder they stood out. English chroniclers like John of Wallingford complained bitterly about Norsemen who bathed regularly and combed their hair daily, claiming they lured women away with tricks of cleanliness. Imagine being so dirty that you think basic hygiene is sorcery. But for the Vikings, this wasn't vanity, it was strategy. A clean man was a presentable man. A presentable man had better luck in trade, negotiation, marriage, and yes, even plunder. In Norse sagas, heroes are often described not by their kill counts, but by their physical appearance. Shining hair, fine clothes, neat beards, these weren't incidental details. They were character references. A man who kept his nails clean was a man who could be trusted to lead, to judge fairly, to inspire. There's something poetic about the idea of a people so associated with violence and chaos, also being deeply committed to grooming. We often imagine history's warriors as walking storms, blood-soaked, snarling, unbothered by their own stench. But the Vikings suggest a different model, one where even the roughest life needs anchors of control, where even in a world that could kill you with a bad harvest or a bad neighbor, you still found time to keep your fingernails respectable. And let's not forget the women. Viking women had their own grooming tools, often just as decorative and certainly just as necessary. Long hair, often braided or coiled into elaborate styles, required daily care. Hairpins, combs, and shears were standard possessions, and female graves often include these items. Cleanliness was not merely the concern of men trying to impress. At court it was a community value, one passed down from mothers to daughters, shaped not by vanity, but by structure. To comb a child's hair was to care for them. To pluck your eyebrows or scrape your ears was to declare, in a small and silent way, I will not go feral today. Of course, this is all relative. Vikings didn't have deodorant or toothpaste, and their version of shampoo could probably strip paint off a longship. Their clothes were heavy, their homes smoky, and winters lasted approximately 8 years. Hygiene, for them, wasn't perfection. It was resistance. It was a way to maintain dignity, to draw a line between yourself and the chaos, and to show up to the mead hall not looking like you just crawled out of a bog. In the end, Viking grooming kits, those small, elegant bundles of tools, weren't just about cleanliness. They were about culture. They told you who someone was, what they valued, and how they saw themselves in a world where surviving was hard and staying human was even harder. So the next time you reach for your nail clippers or roll your eyes at someone with a facial mist in their bag, remember the Vikings, the warriors who brought tweezers to a sword fight, the raiders who combed their hair before charging into battle, the people who made personal hygiene not just practical but mythic. And somewhere, in a museum drawer or a burial mound, there's a small curved spoon that once nestled in a pouch beside a fire, waiting to keep someone's ears clean, which, frankly, is more impressive than most battle axes. There's something inherently noble about the idea of a Viking shivering in a wooden tub, while the northern wind howls like an offended troll outside. This wasn't just rugged stoicism, it was Saturday. In the world of medieval cleanliness, where entire populations viewed soap with the same suspicion one might reserve for poison or witchcraft, the Vikings were different. These were people who didn't just bathe, they scheduled it, every week, without being told by a plague doctor. The tradition was called lagadaga, literally, washing day. And if that sounds vaguely Scandinavian and vaguely familiar, it should. That word eventually morphed into our modern Saturday. Yes, the day you now associate with cartoons, chores, or awkward brunches was once sacred to the act of scraping off a week's worth of grime, blood, smoke, and livestock proximity. It's not exactly spa culture, but for its time, it was practically revolutionary. Let's be clear, this was not the kind of world where personal hygiene was held in high regard. Across much of medieval Europe, regular bathing was a luxury at best and a moral hazard at worst. There were sermons warning against it, doctors raising suspicious eyebrows, and entire towns where the only bathwater anyone saw was the stuff dumped out onto the street. You could go months without a good wash, and many did, either because they lacked the means or because they believed cleanliness opened the pores and, by extension, the gates to hell. And then there were the Vikings marching in with their braided hair, polished combs, and, to the utter horror of Christian chroniclers, freshly scrubbed skin. To the Anglo-Saxons, who had largely abandoned Roman-style bathhouses in favor of praying the dirt away, this was unthinkable. Cleanliness, they reasoned, made you soft, vulnerable, possibly French. But the Norse looked at a hot bath not as a threat to their soul, but as a victory over the miserable climate they lived in. After a week of trudging through mud, huddling with goats, and sleeping next to a smoky hearth in a windowless hall, the bath wasn't indulgent, it was survival. Which brings us to the methods. Picture a Viking settlement in winter, snow piled on rooftops, ice crusting the riverbanks, and everyone wrapped in wool that had absorbed 3 seasons of smoke, sweat, and storytelling. Now picture someone saying, "Let's get naked and jump in the river." That person wasn't suicidal. They were just punctual. It was Saturday, after all. Yes, river bathing was a thing, when the weather permitted, which is to say, when it didn't actively kill you. Many Vikings would wash in natural streams, lakes, or the sea. The brave, the desperate, and those with particularly insistent spouses might even break a hole in the ice and go in anyway. You might say this built character, or, depending on your constitution, cardiac arrest. But for those who liked their extremities unfrozen, there was another option, the badus. These were rudimentary bathhouses, ranging from single-room wooden shacks to more elaborate structures, heated with fire and filled with steam. Think of a sauna, but rougher, smokier, and with more screaming. Not from discomfort necessarily, Vikings were used to that, but from the sudden realization that bathing involved more coordination than expected. The bathhouse process was deceptively simple. Heat stones in a fire, bring them inside, pour water over them to create steam, and hope the roof didn't catch fire. Water would be drawn from a nearby well or river and heated over the hearth or in iron cauldrons. Once warm enough, it was ladled into wooden tubs or poured into shallow basins. Sometimes aromatic herbs like juniper or birch leaves were added, not for any esoteric spiritual purpose, but because the place stank, and so did the people. Inside the bathhouse, you didn't find monastic silence or refined rituals. You found noise. Bathing was social, sometimes even communal. Families or neighbors might bathe together, particularly in winter when heating enough water for everyone separately wasn't realistic, unless you enjoyed chopping firewood until your hands resembled leather sacks. Conversations unfolded, disputes were settled, gossip exchanged. You might leave cleaner, but you also left up to date on whose goat had escaped and whose marriage hadn't survived the last mead-fueled feast. And while they weren't exactly soaking in lavender-scented bubbles, the Vikings did have soap. Theirs was a coarse, greyish substance made by combining animal fat with wood ash, essentially lye soap, functional and vaguely caustic. It could double as shampoo, laundry detergent, or if you were especially unlucky, a sort of exfoliant that removed both dirt and dignity. Some sources suggest it was so strong that Vikings may have used it to bleach their hair, especially those aiming for the ideal blonde, which, yes, was considered desirable even then. Nothing says ferocious sea raider like peroxide pride. Interestingly, personal grooming extended beyond just the bath. After washing, Vikings would typically comb their hair and beards, often with tools made of antler or bone. They'd scrape their nails, clean their ears, and maybe apply a bit of animal fat to keep skin from cracking in the cold. These weren't the actions of a people indifferent to their appearance. They were daily rituals of maintenance, evidence of a culture that, even amid warfare and survival, refused to let basic dignity go out with the bathwater. What makes this all the more impressive is the context. These were people who lived in a world that tried very hard to make everything unpleasant. Winters were brutal. Food was functional at best, offensive at worst. Medical care ranged from good luck to bite on this piece of wood. And yet, despite all that, maybe because of it, they insisted on this weekly routine of washing. And they didn't just keep it at home. Evidence suggests that when Vikings travelled, whether trading down the rivers of Rus or looting monasteries on the British coast, they brought their bathing habits with them. Arabic and Byzantine accounts describe Norse traders stripping down and washing in rivers before meeting locals, presumably to avoid showing up smelling like smoke and salted fish. Even in foreign lands, surrounded by people who thought hygiene was suspicious, the Vikings stood by their rituals. Because if you're going to haggle over silk or sell stolen treasure, it helps not to reek. It's tempting to paint this as mere vanity, but it's not that simple. Bathing had tangible health benefits, though they didn't know the science behind it. The Vikings surely noticed fewer skin problems, infections, or outbreaks when people bathed regularly. It also had social benefits. A clean man or woman was more attractive, more respected, and more likely to find success in marriage, trade, or politics. In sagas, characters are often described by their grooming habits: the clean, the well-kempt, the proud. A disheveled appearance, by contrast, usually meant something had gone terribly wrong. So yes, the weekly bath was cultural, but it was also strategic. A society this familiar with blood understood the importance of washing it off. Of course, this wasn't some utopia of cleanliness. Vikings still lived in smoke-filled halls, with livestock underfoot and mold in the rafters. Children rolled in the dirt, and men went weeks on sea voyages with little more than seawater and curses to keep them fresh. But the point is, when they could, when the fire was lit, the water drawn, and the world hadn't ended, they chose to clean themselves. They carved time into their harsh lives for this odd little ritual of humanity. If you think your shared apartment bathroom is bad, try waiting your turn in a steamy wooden shed with 3 cousins, a barking dog, and a stack of still smoking firewood. There's no privacy, no running water, and if someone opens the door at the wrong time, you're suddenly explaining yourself to a goat. But this, too, was part of the Viking experience. The awkward, the communal, the resilient. Because in the end, bathing wasn't just about comfort, it was about control. In a world ruled by chaos, ice, and the occasional angry god, washing your face once a week was a small, defiant act. It said, I may be mortal, I may die in battle, but by Thor, I will not do it greasy. And so, every lager daga, the tubs came out, the steam rose, and frozen toes were sacrificed to the cause. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even warm half the time, but it was something, a habit, a tradition, a declaration of personhood in a world that didn't always leave room for that. So the next time you curse your cold shower or grumble about low water pressure, remember the Viking standing half naked in the snow, clutching a lump of homemade soap and muttering ancient curses at the wind. He didn't bathe because it was easy. He bathed because it mattered. If you've ever found yourself staring into a mirror, wrestling a beard comb through 3 days of facial chaos, and wondering when exactly you started looking like a suspicious lighthouse keeper, congratulations, you've brushed up against an ancient tradition, one that the Vikings, of all people, took very seriously. Because while the Norse were known for many things pillaging, poetry, shipbuilding, the occasional enthusiastic berserking, they also left behind a lesser-known legacy, beard pride. Not just, I forgot to shave beards, but full-on, statement-making, battle-ready face forests, maintained with a kind of care that teetered between masculine elegance and outright vanity. Yes, Vikings loved their beards, and they didn't just have them, they styled them. The modern stereotype of the Viking is basically a walking wall of hair wild, unkempt, slightly smoky, and possibly hiding a second, smaller Viking underneath. But that image owes more to Victorian fantasy than historical reality. The actual Norse Menthos, sunburned farmers, warriors, and traders of the north were surprisingly well groomed, especially when it came to the art of facial hair. Beards weren't an accident, they were curated. A Viking beard wasn't just about insulation, though it certainly helped when the fjord winds tried to freeze your skull off. It was a symbol, a portable expression of status, strength, and occasionally, swagger. It told you things about a man's age, his place in the community, his patience, and, crucially, his access to grooming tools. You could tell a lot by the beard. If it was neatly braided, trimmed, oiled, and free of livestock remnants, chances were high that its owner was either respected or wanted to be. Historical sources and, more importantly, the things people were buried with make it clear that the Vikings took grooming seriously. Combs carved from antler or bone were practically standard issue. Many were fine-toothed and exquisitely made, the kind of craftsmanship that suggests someone really didn't like tangles. These combs weren't thrown in drawers or hidden in pockets, not that Vikings had pockets. They were worn on belts, dangling in decorative cases, making it clear to the world, yes, I carry a weapon and a grooming kit, because I am complex. And the beard wasn't just a mass of fuzz, Norsemen trimmed, parted, and braided their facial hair with the same attention they gave to the sails of their ships. Some wore long, flowing beards parted down the middle like the Red Sea. Others braided theirs into intricate plaits that were both decorative and, let's be honest, probably a strategic solution to soup-related issues. There are runestone depictions, carvings, and even sagas that hint at these styles, and while they rarely come with a stylist's notes, the artistic consistency says enough. These men were putting effort into their look. What's particularly striking is that this beard attention wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Viking culture, for all its chaos and conquest, was surprisingly judgmental when it came to appearance. A man who didn't keep himself tidy risked more than tangles. He risked his reputation. In the sagas, insults about grooming are vicious. Calling someone unkempt, dirty, or poorly groomed wasn't just an aesthetic critique, it was a moral one. You were lazy, disrespectful, possibly cowardly. There's a saga in which a man is mocked not for losing a fight, but for having food crumbs in his beard. This, apparently, was the greater shame. Of course, maintaining a beard in a Viking climate wasn't easy. Winters were long, damp, and unforgiving. Summer wasn't much better. Picture sweating in a tunic made of scratchy wool while rowing a ship for hours under the sun, and you'll begin to understand why beard hygiene wasn't optional. Beards trapped sweat, dirt, food particles, and the general detritus of a medieval life, lived entirely without wet wipes. Left to its own devices, a Viking beard could become less majestic and more biohazard. So they cleaned them. With water, yes, but also with soap, or at least what passed for it in the Norse world. A lye-based concoction made from wood ash and animal fat, strong enough to clean anything, and possibly strip paint. Some archaeologists believe this soap was so effective, it even bleached hair, potentially explaining why blonde hair was so prized, and why some darker-haired Vikings may have reached for the lye pot, not just for cleanliness, but fashion. Hair oil, too, likely played a role. While no Viking left behind a bottle labeled beard elixir, there's every reason to believe they used animal fats or rendered oils to condition and tame their facial hair. When you live in a climate where your breath can freeze mid-air, you learn quickly that moisture is your friend. Beard oil would have helped prevent brittleness, splitting, and that uncomfortably crunchy texture that comes from sticking your face out into a sleet storm for 6 hours. And then there were the braids. If you've ever tried braiding a beard properly, braiding, not just twisting it into a sad little knot, you'll know it's not a casual affair. It takes time, patience, and a basic understanding of geometry. Viking men who braided their beards weren't just decorating, they were displaying discipline. A carefully braided beard said, "I have the time to maintain this. I have the skill. I care. And also, probably, I haven't lost my comb yet." Beard braids may also have had practical value. For warriors, keeping facial hair under control meant less distraction in battle. No one wants to be mid-axe swing and suddenly find their mustache in their mouth. A tidy braid could mean the difference between looking fierce and looking like you accidentally ate your own beard. It was, in its way, a form of armor, not for the body, but for the ego. The real clincher, though, is how beard care bled into ritual and myth. Norse mythology, after all, is filled with gods and heroes who were as concerned with appearance as they were with battle. Odin himself, All-Father, War God, Cosmic Wanderer, was often depicted with a flowing beard that radiated wisdom and menace in equal measure. Thor, the Thunderbringer, sported hair and beard that thundered right alongside him. To be bearded was to be in the company of the divine, and you didn't show up to emulate the gods with crumbs on your chin and split ends down to your collarbone. Even Loki Patron's saint of chaos and questionable decisions was never depicted as unkempt. Mischievous, yes. Poorly groomed? Never. If the gods set the tone, mortals were expected to follow. And follow they did. Beard competitions weren't likely formal events. but we can safely assume that men compared styles, lengths, and tidiness in between arguments about oxen and the proper way to ferment fish. A clean, neat beard wasn't just a personal preference, it was a social currency. Women noticed, rivals noticed. If you wanted to be taken seriously, you combed your beard. If you wanted to be taken very seriously, you braided it. And if you wanted to be mocked for eternity in a saga, you let it get out of hand. What's telling is that these traditions weren't lost at sea. When Vikings settled abroad in England, in Ireland, in parts of Eastern Europe, brought their grooming habits with them. Archaeological finds in Dublin, a major Norse settlement, include combs and grooming kits of the same quality as those found in Scandinavia. Even in foreign lands, beard care was carried on. Being a foreign invader was no excuse for looking sloppy. And this brings us, inevitably, to the modern resurgence of Viking beards. Somewhere between history and hipsterdom, the Norse aesthetic has made a comeback: runestone tattoos, long beards, hair undercuts, and the occasional inappropriate use of the word berserker. But the beard is the real survivor. Men today still wear Viking-style beards with pride, often unaware that they're tapping into a centuries-old tradition of grooming, social status, and passive-aggressive judgment from your fellow boatmates. Of course, the context is different now. You're not washing your beard with soap made from pig fat and lye, or combing it by firelight in a smoky longhouse while the wind whistles through the wooden walls. You probably have conditioner, maybe even a beard balm with a label that says something like forest musk or Arctic spice, but the impulse is the same: to take something wild and make it presentable. To declare, without words, that this beard is not an accident, it is a choice. Because deep down, the battle for beard dignity is as old as the fjords. It's not just about hair, it's about effort, pride, belonging, a refusal to let the cold, chaotic world win. And so the Vikings, those legendary sea wolves with axes in hand and combs at their belt, stand as a reminder that even the roughest men cared deeply about how they looked. They didn't always get it right. Sometimes the beard grew faster than the wisdom, but they tried, with oil, with combs, with braided patience. And when they looked in the mirror well, the polished bronze shield, they didn't see filth. They saw something worthy of song. And if that isn't epic, I don't know what is. There comes a point in every deep dive into Viking hygiene when you have to stop, take a long breath, ideally, not through your nose, and acknowledge the uncomfortable truth. For all their scrubbing, steaming, and bone comb bravado, the Vikings still reeked. Not all the time, and not because they were indifferent to cleanliness, quite the opposite, but because there are certain smells you just can't argue with. Sweat, smoke, animal fat, sour milk, wet wool. Let's be honest, if you crammed 3 generations, 6 goats, a stack of half-dried fish, and the remains of last week's stew into a smoky, unventilated log house and sealed the door for winter, you would not emerge with a fragrant bouquet. No amount of bone combing is going to fix that. And yet this is where the Norse lived, loved, plotted, gave birth, died, sang songs, drank heavily, told long rambling stories about that one time Thor cross-dressed, and occasionally remembered to bathe. The Viking longhouse, for all its architectural sturdiness and community spirit, was essentially a wooden box of smells. It was a hearth, a barn, a bedroom, a pantry, and a locker room all at once. It was functional, it was warm, and it was, by any modern standard, deeply pungent. If you think your roommate leaving gym socks under the couch is bad, try living with an open fire, a drying rack full of wet sheepskins, and a family of pigs, indoors. Longhouses were feats of engineering in their own, right, built from timber, often with thatched or turf roofs, and designed to withstand the eternal Scandinavian wind. But insulation came at a price. Most of these homes had a single central hearth that burned day and night. Not in a charming, crackling, marshmallow roasting way, but in the sort of way that filled the room with an eternal cloud of smoke that didn't quite find its way out through the roof hole. If you've ever stood too close to a bonfire and spent the next 48 hours smelling like a campfire burrito, you're halfway there. Now imagine that every possession you own, including your bed, clothes, food, tools, and yes, hair, absorbs that smoke day in, day out. You don't even notice it after a while. But anyone new who walks in, their eyes start watering before you finish saying, "Welcome." The thing is, Vikings didn't build smoky homes because they liked the ambience. Smoke was the unfortunate price of survival. It kept the room warm, deterred bugs, preserved food, and added a kind of vague antiseptic quality to the air. It also slowly turned everything and everyone a soft, dingy grey. Eyes stung, lungs suffered, and yes, your hair probably crunched a little if you touched it on the wrong day. Then there was the sweat, and we're not talking the light summer jog kind. Viking life was, at its core, a daily series of labor-intensive activities carried out in wool. There was no gym, because every waking moment was the gym. Farming, hauling water, chopping wood, rowing, blacksmithing, building ships, herding animals that had no interest in being herded. Imagine doing CrossFit in a sheepskin tunic. Now imagine never fully drying off. Even with their admirable dedication to weekly bathing, daily sweat was part of the fabric sometimes, literally, and those fabrics didn't always get cleaned. Laundry, in the Viking Age, wasn't a toss it in and forget it affair. It was a production involving cold rivers, caustic soap, hours of scrubbing, and a high chance of frozen hands, depending on the season. So most clothing, especially heavier outer garments, got cleaned occasionally. The result? That unmistakable scent of seasoned warrior meets summer barn. And then, just to add another aromatic layer, we have the food. Viking cuisine wasn't particularly known for its subtlety. It was heavy on the fish, dried, salted, smoked, and occasionally buried in the ground for fun and fermentation. There was dairy, often in the form of soured milk products, which sounds exotic until you realize it's basically medieval yogurt left in a wooden bucket near a goat. There was also a liberal use of animal phaeton food in cooking, and sometimes on skin, as a crude form of moisturizer or wind block. Because when your only barrier between your face and a winter storm is a layer of grease, you go with what works. All of this fish oils, sour milk, preserved meats lived alongside the people. It didn't stay in the kitchen because there was no kitchen. The hearth was the center of everything, and that meant whatever you cooked, you inhaled. Over time, the longhouse began to develop its own signature scent, a layered perfume of smoke, sweat, boiled fish, damp earth, wet fur, and the occasional hint of sheep. Eau de fjord, if you will. Now, lest you think this was purely a matter of poor planning, remember that many Viking settlements were remote, and options were limited. Climate didn't allow for much in the way of open-air architecture for half the year. Longhouses were designed to trap heat, not release fragrance. Doors stayed shut. Windows, if they existed at all, were small slits covered in skin or thin wood. Fresh air was a luxury, not a design feature. And the people inside weren't just passing through. These houses weren't summer cottages. Families could live in the same longhouse for generations, occasionally expanding or repairing, but rarely moving, which meant that every season of sweat, every smoked fish, every damp fur cloak left its trace. Over time, the very walls absorbed the history along with the smell. Add to this the livestock. Many longhouses had designated spaces for animals, often separated by a partial wall or low barrier. The idea was practical. Animals generated heat. On cold nights, sharing your roof with cows and sheep meant a slightly warmer home and, of course, a deeply aromatic one. The floor might be covered in straw, rushes, or animal skins, but underneath, dirt, or worse, mud. If there was a drainage system, it was nature, and nature doesn't prioritize your olfactory comfort. It wasn't that the Vikings wanted to live in funk. In fact, their personal grooming habits suggest they actively tried to avoid it. They bathed, combed, scrubbed, and cleaned as much as their circumstances allowed. But some smells weren't about effort, they were about environment. You could be the cleanest person in Norway and still walk out of your house smelling like a stew that sat too close to the fire for too long. There's also the matter of toilets, or rather, the medieval lack thereof. Viking settlements had latrines of varying sophistication, from simple pits to more elaborate outhouses. But let's not kid ourselves. Waste management in the 10th century was more keep it far enough from the well than modern sanitation. In winter, chamber pots made a return indoors, and while they were emptied regularly, hopefully, the olfactory consequences were inevitable. Combined with low ceilings and a love of fermented dairy, you start to understand why visiting a Viking home might have required a moment of mental preparation. If a longhouse could talk, it wouldn't speak in words. It would just breathe out a long, heavy sigh and knock you flat with the weight of centuries of cohabitation. So what did the Vikings do about all this? Besides opening the door every now and then and pretending it helped, they adapted. They leaned into smoke as a kind of crude air freshener. They used herbs juniper, birch, yarrow burned in the fire, or hung in bunches to try to push back against the more persistent smells. Some were antiseptic, others just strong enough to mask what lay beneath. Personal items like cloaks or bedding might be aired out on warmer days, especially when the smell of wet wool became less nostalgic and more concerning. And they learned to live with it. When everyone smells like the longhouse, no one notices. Cultural baselines shift. What we would find unbearable, they accepted as normal. When the occasional trader from Byzantium showed up smelling like citrus oil and imported silk, the locals probably assumed he was just eccentric, and possibly in danger of freezing to death without the protective layer of smell. But perhaps most importantly, they didn't let the smell define them. Viking culture, rich in poetry, lore, craft, and myth, wasn't limited by the reality of indoor goats and damp rushes. Their sagas weren't about air quality. They were about bravery, honor, loyalty, and the belief that life was a thing to be endured with style, even if that style came with a faint hint of cheese. Because that's the thing about Viking life, it wasn't about chasing comfort. It was about surviving discomfort with grit, humor, and occasionally a nicely braided beard. And if that meant tolerating a bit of sour milk and smoke, so be it. You made it work. You aired your cloak, burned some herbs, and hoped the wind would shift. So no, Viking homes didn't smell like lavender. They smelled like life, messy, stubborn, enduring life. They smelled like wool and wood smoke, wet dogs and wild herbs, sweat and soap and survival. And if that doesn't make you appreciate your air purifier just a little more, nothing will. It's easy to picture Viking women as background characters in a saga, stirring a pot of stew, braiding hair beside the hearth, offering cryptic advice about ominous dreams. But the truth is far less passive and infinitely more fragrant. Behind every beard-wielding warrior stomping off to sea was a woman scrubbing, boiling, steeping, and scraping to keep the household and everyone in it from turning into a biological hazard. If Viking hygiene had a backbone, it wasn't the comb or the bathhouse. It was the woman standing behind them, armed with a cauldron of lye soap and the kind of herb knowledge that could impress a modern apothecary or terrify a medieval bishop. These weren't women dabbing at their wrists with rosewater while humming gently. These were women who understood the difference between moss for wounds and moss for insulation, who could make soap from scratch, who knew which herbs repelled lice, which soothed childbirth, and which, if administered incorrectly, could send a man to meet Odin a little earlier than scheduled. They ran households that doubled as clinics, kitchens, textile factories, and part-time animal shelters all under one smoked roof, and usually with children underfoot and goats attempting to eat the laundry. If you were a Norse woman, your work didn't end when the fire was lit or the stew was simmering. That was just the warm-up. You were also responsible for making the soap, weaving the cloth, caring for the sick, preserving the food, maintaining the bedding, tending to the livestock, and occasionally mediating a family dispute over who left a dried fish in the boots again. In other words, the standard job description required stamina, patience, and a working knowledge of lye chemistry. And let's talk about that soap. Modern soap comes in pastel colors and names like Citrus Sunrise or Alpine Breeze. Viking soap, by contrast, was a brick of unapologetic necessity. It was handmade from ash and animal fat ingredients that, when combined and cooked to the right degree of caustic perfection, produced a gritty, no-nonsense cleanser that could strip away weeks of grime and possibly some skin. It didn't smell good, it wasn't pH balanced, but it worked. And the woman who could make it properly was worth her weight in dried cod. Soap wasn't just for bodies either. It was used on hair, clothing, tools, and even to scour cooking pots. This was not a single-purpose luxury item. This was all-purpose battle gear against dirt, bacteria, and general decay. Creating it required fire, vigilance, and the sort of gut-level intuition that let you know when a substance had reached just the right level of cleansing but not yet corrosive. A slip in either direction meant your tunic still smelled like fish, or your hands looked like you tried to handshake a volcano. And when soap wasn't enough, the herbs came out. Viking women were walking botanical encyclopedias. They didn't just grow herbs, they harvested them at the correct moon phase, dried them with care, stored them in linen, and dispensed them like fragrant spells. Need to soothe a fever? There's an herb for that. Fighting off a lice outbreak? There's a salve. Cradle rash? Digestive complaints? Stinky shoes? You guessed it. Herbs. The Norse herbalist was equal parts pharmacist and wizard. Juniper branches were burned for their antiseptic smoke. Birch leaves were steeped into hair rinses that made Viking locks a bit less like straw and a bit more like battle-ready silk. Yarrow could be chewed for toothaches or brewed to stop bleeding. Plantainino, not the banana kind, was used for everything from insect bites to skin infections. These weren't quaint folk remedies whispered in candlelight. These were proven tools in the fight against the daily avalanche of minor injuries, smells, and ailments that defined early medieval life. And who deployed these tools with tireless precision? Women. Women who knew that the laundry wouldn't do itself, the food wouldn't preserve itself, and the lice certainly wouldn't pack up and leave politely. Viking households didn't have cleaning services. They had mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives who made sure that the floors were covered in fresh straw, the children were less crusty than yesterday, and the men didn't march off to war, smelling like old porridge. Let's pause here to consider what clean actually meant in this context. This wasn't sterilized, lemon, fresh, magazine, cover clean. This was functionally clean. Your goal wasn't to impress guests with white linens. Spoiler, white was a hard color to keep white. Your goal was to keep your household from descending into pestilential chaos. You boiled water. You aired out blankets. You smoked meat, dried fish, scraped hides, and occasionally sprinkled the floor with sand, herbs, or crushed shells, whatever absorbed smells, and didn't get tracked into bed. Cleanliness was layered into the rhythm of daily life. Clothes were scrubbed in rivers, using that aforementioned lye soap. Hair was combed, not for vanity alone, but to root out the inevitable lice. Bedding was shaken out, and sometimes beaten with sticks either, to remove dust, or possibly just as a socially acceptable way to work out frustration. The longhouse was swept with brooms made from twigs. And if you were lucky enough to live near a stream, that water became the engine of your domestic world, for washing, rinsing, cooling, and probably crying into when winter lasted too long. None of this was easy. The tools were primitive, the work was relentless, and the results, while hard-earned, were temporary at best. You could clean the floor in the morning and find chicken droppings there by lunch. You could wash your children and watch them roll directly back into the mud, but the effort mattered. Cleanliness, in Viking culture, wasn't just a convenience, It was a point of pride, a standard, a line between savagery and civility that Viking women refused to let fade. Even the sagas, which were rarely interested in domestic details unless they involved revenge or drunken speeches, occasionally nod to this. There are passing references to women rinsing hair, preparing herbs, tending wounds, and managing the home with quiet authority. And while the historical record is understandably male-heavy raids, battles, kings, and so own archaeological digs, continue to uncover combs, tweezers, spatulas, and soap-making tools buried with women. Items not just of function, but of identity. Because if a man's axe said, "I am strong," a woman's soap pot said, "I keep this world turning." What's more, women didn't just run the home. In many cases, they ran the farm, especially when the men were off sailing to distant shores to see if Ireland still had anything worth stealing. A woman's role encompassed every aspect of survival: food production, clothing maintenance, healing, cleaning, childcare, and occasionally throwing sharp objects when someone got out of line. In Viking society, power wasn't always worn like a crown. Sometimes it smelled faintly of juniper and came with its own homemade soap recipe. Even childbirth, arguably the most intense and unglamorous of Viking experiences, was handled with impressive poise. There were no hospitals, no anesthesia, and no sterile equipment. There were herbs. There were midwives. There were hands that had done this before, and knowledge passed down not in books, but in stories, rituals, and practice. The same hands that stirred porridge in the morning could be delivering a child by evening, all while keeping the hearth burning and the toddlers from catching on fire. And yes, there were love potions, or at least herbal mixtures with reputations. Viking women were well aware of the connections between scent, health, and attraction. Baths might include bundles of birch or sweet-smelling plants. Ointments could be spiced with local flora. Was it magic? Maybe not in the lightning bolt sense. But making a smelly man smell slightly less like a damp goat, that's a kind of magic in itself. Even the household tools spoke to this expertise. Mortars and pestles for grinding herbs, wooden vats for brewing soaps or dyes, iron cauldrons that could boil anything into submission. It's no wonder that outsiders sometimes viewed Viking women as witches, not in the broomstick sense, but because they possessed the kind of knowledge that blurred the line between practical and powerful. A woman who could cure illness, ease pain, soften skin, and make a man's socks less offensive was, in a very real sense, commanding forces beyond the obvious. None of this was done with an audience. There were no accolades for managing to keep the family lice count under control, or for producing another batch of serviceable lye soap. But these small daily rituals were what held Viking society together. Behind every shield wall was a woman who packed the food. Behind every saga hero was someone who patched his tunic, cut his hair, and made sure his beard didn't turn into a wildlife refuge. And when those heroes fell in battle and were laid to rest, it was the women who prepared the body, washed it, combed it, sent it into the next world with dignity. Cleanliness, in this context, wasn't just about appearances. It was about respect for the self, for others, for life, even when it was messy and hard and smelled like smoked herring. Viking women didn't chase perfection. They carved out order. They lit the fire, stirred the herbs, and faced the world with a kind of quiet, scrubbed resilience. So no, they didn't wear linen aprons and sing while sweeping. They didn't daintily spritz lavender water on their pillowcases. But they kept the fleas at bay, the soap pot boiling, and the longhouse just clean enough to survive another week. And in a world of mud, blood, and fire, that was nothing short of heroic. Few things can humble the human spirit faster than the sudden, unyielding question, "Where's the bathroom?" It's a query that unites us all across time, geography, and social class, and the Vikings were no exception. Yes, they had long ships, long houses, and long beards, but what they didn't have were long lines of indoor plumbing. This is a chapter about the Norse world's least glamorous, but most universally relatable topic. Where did the Vikings go when nature called? Because when we picture Viking life, we tend to focus on the dramatic, ships slicing through northern seas, swords clashing in the mists of battle, feast halls roaring with song. What we conveniently skip is what happened after the feast, the moment when all that mead and mutton demanded a reckoning. For all their power and prowess, Vikings were still people with digestive systems. And those systems rugged, though they may have been still required, the occasional quiet corner and a hole in the ground. Let's get one thing out of the way. Vikings did not have toilets, as we know them. There were no porcelain thrones, no flush handles, and certainly no mint-scented hand soap resting delicately beside the sink. The Norse version of the facilities was a bit more rustic, a bit more exposed, and a lot more dependent on your tolerance for cold air and questionable footing. The most common solution was the latrine pit, a term that sounds slightly more dignified than what it actually was. A hole in the earth, dug to a reasonable depth, often lined with wooden planks or stones to prevent cave-ins and minimize splatter-related trauma. If you were luckier, if someone in the household had architectural ambitions, there might be a wooden seat placed over the pit, perhaps even with a crude lid to keep out the rain, rats, and unfortunate accidents. If you weren't lucky, you squatted. These pits were often placed a short walk from the longhouse, usually downhill or downwind, depending on which seemed more pressing. In cold months, this little stroll was a brisk, unpleasant shuffle that made one question every dietary decision from the last 3 days. In warmer months, the smell alone would let you know when you were getting close. No signs needed. Now, it would be deeply unfair to say that Vikings didn't care about sanitation. They absolutely did. They just had different tools and expectations. Waste was typically buried, and pits were occasionally moved or covered over once they became, let's say, overly committed to their purpose. Some households had small outhouse-like structures over these pits. Others made do with screens of woven branches, or the occasional privacy-providing shrubbery. Let's not kid ourselves. Privacy wasn't a top priority. Function beat form, always. For those moments when venturing outside was either socially inconvenient or thermally impossible, which, in Scandinavia, was much of the year, the chamber pot made its heroic entrance. These were simple bowls or buckets, made of ceramic, wood, or metal, tucked beside beds or hidden behind furniture, used primarily at night or during harsh weather. It wasn't glamorous, but it spared you a midnight journey into the freezing dark, which, given the number of things that could bite, freeze, or surprise you along the way, was a victory worth celebrating. The chamber pot was emptied, ideally, the next morning. Some were dumped into the latrine pit. Others were flung out into designated waste areas, hopefully away from communal footpaths, and definitely away from the well. The proximity of waste to water was, as you might imagine, a recurring issue in medieval settlements. Disease didn't require a science degree to understand, but the link between contaminated water and sickness wasn't always crystal clear, which means that while Vikings were cleaner than many of their European counterparts, they were still occasionally undone by a poorly placed dump site and an optimistic thirst. In urban Viking settlements, like Jorvik, modern-day York, the picture gets a bit more organized, though still smelly. Archaeological digs have revealed actual wooden toilet seats used over pits, complete with rounded openings and smoothed edges. It's a strange detail to marvel at, but there's something comforting in knowing that even 10 years ago, someone sat on that same shape and thought, yes, this is better. These urban toilets were sometimes communal and often located near other service areas like workshops or refuse pits. Because nothing says efficient city planning like combining your blacksmithing and bathroom breaks. Cleaning oneself afterward was, as you might guess, also a bit more tactile than today. Vikings did not have rolls of triple-ply toilet paper, nor did they debate the ethical implications of wet wipes. Instead, They used what was available: moss, leaves, scraps of cloth, snow, yes, really, or even a handful of straw in desperate times. Moss, in particular, was favored for its softness, abundance, and vaguely antiseptic properties. Of course, using moss effectively required a bit of practice and a strong stomach. But again, this was a culture that thought fermented shark was a delicacy. For women, hygiene during menstruation was handled with the same resourceful practicality. There are no surviving Norse tampon boxes or pad advertisements, but cloth rags washed and reused were likely the standard. There's some speculation that moss or other absorbent natural materials may have played a role, layered into clothing or fastened with belts or bands. It's not well documented, but given the level of resourcefulness evident in every other domestic aspect of Viking life, it's safe to say they figured it out, and with less fuss than many of us would like to imagine. Interestingly, the Norse did seem to recognize the importance of separating waste from clean living space, at least in theory. Midden heaps, essentially ancient garbage dumps, were placed away from longhouses, and waste areas were kept to the outskirts of the settlement. But away is relative when you're talking about a compact village surrounded by snowdrifts and fjords. The result? Let's just say that while Vikings had a better understanding of cleanliness than many of their medieval peers, the bar wasn't set especially high. And then there's the smell. Because despite their efforts, despite the chamber pots and moss and occasional snow-based cleansing, Viking settlements had an atmosphere. Archaeological sites in places like Dublin and York often reveal layers of compacted waste, broken pots, animal bones, hair combs and, yes, copious amounts of fecal matter. Scientists have studied these layers in painstaking detail, uncovering information about diet, health, parasites, and most pungently, how much time people spent walking through the results of communal living. It's telling that some of the most informative finds from Viking dig sites are ancient poops, known scientifically as coprolites, and less scientifically as, why did I choose archaeology? One such specimen, the famous Lloyd's Bank turd found in York, measures a glorious 8 inches long and tells us, with disturbing clarity, what one Viking ate, how badly it went, and how surprisingly little he chewed. It also contained parasite eggs, proof that even a society as hygiene conscious as the Vikings couldn't completely escape the microscopic side of life. None of this means the Vikings were filthy. Quite the opposite, they were probably among the cleanest Europeans of their time. But even they had limits. When your plumbing system is a bucket and your bidet is a handful of lichen, there's only so much refinement you can expect. Still, the effort mattered. Vikings bathed weekly, cleaned their tools, combed their hair, scrubbed their clothes, and did what they could to keep the worst of the waste out of sight and mind. And that's really the heart of it. Viking sanitation was not about comfort, it was about necessity. It was about drawing the line, however, muddy between livable and unbearable, between surviving and thriving. And even if the pit latrine was only a few planks over a hole, it still meant something. It meant intention, maintenance. The acknowledgement that no matter how fearsome your reputation, you still had to find a place to poop in peace. So the next time you complain about a slightly dirty public restroom or an understocked toilet paper roll, spare a thought for the Norse, for the midnight bucket dumpers, the moss gatherers, the people who faced the harshest elements and still managed to carve out a little square of earth for the most basic human need. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't luxurious, but it worked. And really, what more can you ask from a world without plumbing? There are few things in history more humbling than realizing a Viking had better teeth than you. Yes, you owner of the ergonomic toothbrush, dental insurance plan, and that little water flosser that lives under your sink and mostly gathers dust. Because while we tend to imagine Norse warriors as wild-eyed berserkers, frothing with bloodlust, and occasionally bits of breakfast, archaeological reality has quietly revealed something far more unsettling. Their teeth. Surprisingly solid. Unwhitened, yes. Lacking the sparkle of modern fluoride, absolutely. But for people who routinely chewed on dried fish and boiled barley, their dental health wasn't half bad. Which raises an obvious and slightly embarrassing question: how did they manage that? Because the Viking toolkit was not exactly bursting with dentist-approved gadgets. There were no minty fresh gels, no cinnamon-flavored floss, no annual checkups involving a gentle lecture from someone named Megan. What they did have, however, was a hard life, a gritty diet, and a culturally ingrained habit of grooming that somewhat impressively included their teeth. Let's start with the evidence. Viking graves are an unlikely goldmine for dental anthropology. When archaeologists crack open a burial mound metaphorically, and with proper permits, they're not just looking for swords and beads, they're peering into jaws. Because teeth are the tiny, stubborn fossils of everyday life. They hold secrets: what you ate, how often you cleaned, how much grit you chewed, and whether you spent your life gnashing in pain or smiling with smug Norse confidence. And what these teeth reveal is that, overall, Vikings had relatively healthy mouths for people living in a world where you were just as likely to die from a splinter as a sword. Sure, there were cavities, especially in the later centuries as diets shifted, but nowhere near the sugar-induced dental carnage seen in some post-medieval populations. There was wear and tear, of course. Molars ground down from years of chewing on coarse bread, all as appetizingly sand that found its way into everything. There were abscesses and infections here and there, but on the whole, not bad at all. One reason for this is painfully simple. Vikings didn't eat sugar, not refined sugar, at least, which is the main villain in most modern tooth decay. There were no cakes, candies, or sugary drinks to sneak their way into molars and set up camp. Sweetness, when it appeared, came from honey, which was expensive, limited, and usually reserved for special occasions or medicinal use. A Viking child couldn't just sneak into the pantry and down a soda, because there was no soda and definitely no pantry. There was salted fish, dried meat, barley porridge, and the occasional bitter berry. Now, this doesn't mean their breath smelled like a field of daisies. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. A fish-heavy diet, fermented dairy, and infrequent opportunities for fresh herbs probably made halitosis a recurring character in the Viking household drama. But there's a difference between bad breath and actual dental disease, and the former doesn't rot your jawbone. So what did Vikings do for their teeth exactly? Surely they weren't just sitting around waiting for molars to crumble like old timber. Well, for starters, there's the curious case of toothpicks. Small, pointed tools sometimes made from bone or wood have been found in Norse settlements, clearly shaped for dental use. These weren't novelty items, or the result of someone getting bored with a chicken bone. These were intentional, regularly used, the ancient equivalent of post-meal flossing, minus the mint and branding. If you've ever had something stuck between your teeth for more than 10 seconds, you'll understand that even without a toothbrush, people will find a way. The urge to pick is eternal. And then there's the theoretic parts impressive and stomach-turning that some Vikings may have used small fish bones to floss. Let that image linger. It sounds absurd at first, like something invented to sell museum souvenirs, but it holds water. Fish bones were everywhere. Thin, flexible ones could easily be used to reach between teeth. It wouldn't be comfortable, but neither is actual flossing, if we're honest. And given the Norse talent for repurposing every scrap of the natural world into a tool, it's not such a stretch. If they could turn birch bark into rope and antler into combs, using a fish rib to dislodge dinner is just creative multitasking. There's also evidence of tooth filing intentional modification of the enamel to create grooves or notches. This wasn't for dental health, but likely a status marker or intimidation tactic. Found mostly in Scandinavian warrior graves, these filed teeth would have stood out, especially when paired with battle gear and a blood-curdling yell. Imagine smiling at your enemy across the battlefield, revealing carefully grooved incisors. It's both culturally fascinating and a dental horror show. Not everyone had these markings, but enough did to suggest that teeth weren't just tools for chewing, they were also tools for self-expression, or at least for making sure no one sat too close at the feast. As for actual cleaning, it seems Vikings were not content to let tartar build unchecked. Some researchers suggest they may have used cloth, or even moss as a kind of brush, rubbing it along their teeth to remove buildup. Moss, in particular, shows up in all sorts of hygiene-related context-wound dressing, toiletry, insulation, so why not dental scrubbing? Birch twigs, too, might have been chewed to fray the ends and used as an early version of the chew stick, a tooth-cleaning method known in many ancient cultures. Birch is mildly antiseptic and common in the north, and if you've got 10 minutes and a mouthful of boredom, a twig is a pretty obvious solution. Toothpaste, as we know it, didn't exist, but that doesn't mean nothing was used. A mixture of ash, salt, crushed herbs, or even ground charcoal may have been applied, particularly during bathing rituals or before major events. It wouldn't have tasted good. In fact, it likely tasted like regret, but it would have scrubbed away plaque, at least in theory. When your beauty routine includes smearing lye-based soap on your skin and rubbing animal fat into your hair, a mouthful of salt ash probably just feels like Wednesday. But what's even more revealing than the tools and techniques is the attitude behind them. Vikings weren't just grooming for health, they were grooming for pride. Cleanliness was tied to social standing. A well-kept appearance, teeth included, was a sign of control, of order, of not being an animal even when life constantly tried to turn you into one. The sagas rarely describe characters with rotting teeth. When a smile is mentioned, it's usually white, fierce, and slightly terrifying. You can't be the hero of a saga with a mouth like a crumbling ruin. You have to gleam, even if it's just for one blood-soaked sentence. It's also worth noting that Viking burials often included grooming tools, combs, tweezers, pig's butt, no toothbrushes, at least not in the modern sense. This could mean a few things. Maybe dental tools didn't last well archaeologically. Maybe they weren't seen as significant enough for burial. Or maybe more likely they simply used everyday objects like sticks, cloth, or fingers, which didn't get a special burial slot but were part of daily life nonetheless. Not every tool makes it into the grave goods. Some simply get tossed in the fire or worn down to a splinter. And then there are the things the teeth themselves tell us that no saga could. Microscopic wear patterns, enamel erosion, signs of malnutrition or illness. A chipped incisor that someone lived with for years, quietly enduring the pain while hauling wood or raising goats. These are the small, silent details that turn history from legend into life. They remind us that Vikings weren't just characters. They were people who winced at toothaches, who prodded at stuck meat with a sharp stick, who probably sighed deeply when their molar cracked during a hard winter. So yes, some of them filed their teeth to look more fearsome. Others probably cursed every time they did. Some cleaned with cloth, some with twigs, and a few, perhaps bravest of all, with fish bones. But they did it. They cared. In a world of mud, mead, and meager sunlight, they carved out a space for dignity, one tooth at a time. In the end, Viking dental habits weren't perfect. Their mouths weren't immune to decay, infection, or accident. But considering the tools, the climate, and the sheer logistical hurdles involved, they did remarkably well. Better than some of us with electric toothbrushes and quarterly reminders from our dentists. They didn't smile with blinding whiteness, but they did smile with teeth that had faced the world, chewed its toughest offerings, and, somehow, endured. Which, if you think about it, is kind of what being a Viking was all about. There are many ways to impress someone. You could show up with a well-rehearsed poem, win a duel, or own a ship. But if you were a Viking looking to impress in 10th century Scandinavia, there was one low-tech but surprisingly effective trick. Show up clean. Not just less dirty than the others, clean, properly, noticeably, saga-worthy clean. Because in Viking culture, cleanliness wasn't just a matter of personal hygiene, it was a public performance, a kind of social theatre that involved a comb, a cloak that didn't smell like regret, and, ideally, a beard that had been recently untangled from the remains of yesterday's stew. We tend to picture Vikings as gloriously unwashed, muscled chaos in human form storming into monasteries with the musk of war and smoked herring trailing behind them. But if you actually read the sagast, long, dramatic, often meandering epic tales of Viking life, you find something different. You find people deeply concerned with appearances, and not just don't look like you just woke up in a bog concerned. We're talking, I will literally insult your grooming habits in a formal poem before stabbing you concerned. The sagas are full of dramatic tension, complicated family trees, and the occasional blood feud over sheep, but underneath the vengeance and bravado is a surprisingly consistent theme. How you looked and, by extension, how you smelled was a reflection of who you were. Respectable people looked respectable. They wore clean tunics. They combed their hair. They didn't have visible crust. Being disheveled was not charming. It was suspicious. If a man walked into a gathering looking wild-eyed, greasy-haired, and stained with mysterious substances, people didn't just wrinkle their noses. They whispered. Maybe he was cursed. Maybe he'd lost his status. Maybe he was a coward. Or worse, maybe he didn't respect the people he was visiting enough to bother washing. Cleanliness, in other words, was political and romantic. Because for all the jewels and boasts, a lot of Viking life, like most of human life, came down to courtship. And in a world where marriage was both a personal decision and a land acquisition strategy, your presentation mattered. If you wanted to impress a potential partner or their very large brothers, showing up with clean nails and neatly combed hair was a good start. You didn't just bring gifts, you brought grooming. One saga even mentions a woman evaluating a suitor by how often he changed his clothes. Spoiler, not often enough. She passed. And who can blame her? The bar wasn't high, but it did exist. A man who couldn't manage basic hygiene probably wasn't going to manage a farm, raise cattle, or survive a sea voyage without becoming aggressively moldy. Of course, being clean in the Viking Age was a different beast from being clean now. There was no hot running water, no mint-scented shampoo, no emergency deodorant stick in the bottom of a leather satchel. Clean meant you had made an effort. You had gone to the river. You had scraped, rinsed, maybe used some lye soap if you were feeling fancy or brave. You had combed your hair, probably with a fine-toothed implement made from antler. You had smoothed your beard, or at least removed the larger twigs. And this mattered not just to your romantic prospects, but to your reputation as a functioning adult. In the sagas, cleanliness is often a narrative shorthand. Heroes are described as well-groomed, neatly dressed, or bright in appearance. Villains, or at least socially questionable types, are often shabby, unclean, or greasy. And while these may seem like throwaway details, they're not. In a culture where writing was rare and oral storytelling was everything, descriptions mattered. Every adjective pulled its weight. When someone in a saga is introduced as bright-eyed and well-kept, it means something. It means they are confident, respected, a person of their word. When someone is described as slouched, with dirty hair and tattered clothes, you know trouble is coming. This man has no honor, possibly no livestock, maybe a trail of bad debts and worse decisions. Even the gods weren't immune to this obsession with cleanliness and appearance. In Lokasena, a poem from the poetic Edda, Loki crashes a feast and insults the gods one by one. It's petty, chaotic, and deeply Norse. But one of the first things he does, he mocks a god for being too well-groomed. That's right, even in divine insults, hair maintenance comes up. Loki, king of undermining, knows that calling a god too pretty is just as cutting as calling them a coward. Because appearance was a currency. And like any form of wealth, it had to be managed. Even hospitality rituals included grooming. If a guest arrived at your home, you didn't just offer food. You offered water to wash, a place to comb their hair, a cloak to change into if theirs was soaked through. It was basic decency, sure, but also a status exchange. I treat you well because I am worth respecting. You accept because you intend to act with honor. It wasn't just about comfort. It was about the rules of the game. And like all rules, they could be broken deliberately. There are sagas in which people show up unwashed on purpose to make a point. Maybe they've just returned from exile. Maybe they're in mourning. Maybe they want to show contempt for someone else's status by refusing to play along. It's the medieval equivalent of not dressing up for a wedding because you're still angry about last year's inheritance squabble. It's petty, it's symbolic, and it tells everyone in the room exactly where you stand. What's fascinating is that this preoccupation with hygiene and presentation wasn't about hiding the dirtiness of life, it was about organizing it. Everyone knew the world was messy, that longhouses smoked, that winters made you smell like wool stew. The Vikings didn't deny this, but they believed you had a responsibility to fight it, not with perfection, but with intention. You showed up clean to show that you could, that you had the discipline, the resources, the respect for others to try. And trying mattered. It's easy, from the comfort of our climate-controlled, soap-scented world, to laugh at the idea of a comb being a status symbol. But imagine life without mirrors, without laundry machines, without easy access to hot water. Every act of grooming was a deliberate interruption in the chaos of survival. Every comb stroke was a declaration. I am not giving in to the mud, the smoke, or the overwhelming urge to just become a wool-covered forest hermit. So when a saga says a man was handsome and always clean, that's not just a flirtation cue. That's shorthand for reliability, self-control, and maybe even leadership. People trusted you more when you didn't look like you'd been raised by trolls. And women, let's not forget, were both judges and participants in this system. They managed much of the household cleanliness. They were the ones steeping herbs, boiling water, making soap out of ash and animal fat. They were the ones handing over the combs, washing the linens, insisting that you not wear your blood-stained tunic to dinner again. Their standards shaped the social code. If the community had expectations, it's because women enforced them, taught them, embodied them. Which brings us to another dimension: power. Because being clean wasn't just about being liked, it was about being respected. A chieftain who looked unwashed would lose face. A guest who ignored grooming rituals might lose trust. A warrior who showed up to a meeting with tangled hair and a stained cloak wasn't just offending the eye, she was undermining the very fabric of honor-based society. This, ultimately, is what the sagas whisper behind the feuds and fate-bound speeches. That hygiene was hierarchy. That even in a world of blood oaths and mead-fueled vengeance, there was room for soap, scrubbing, and someone sighing loudly while trying to comb twigs out of their beard. The idea of smelling like a hero wasn't metaphorical. If you walked into a hall reeking of sweat, smoke, and unwashed sheep, you might be a farmer. If you walked in scented with birch, clean linen, and the unmistakable lack of visible lice, you were someone to pay attention to. Someone with discipline, someone who might just make it into the next saga. So the next time you picture a Viking broad-shouldered, axe in hand, cloak billowing in the wind, forget the smaller details. The comb tucked into his belt, the clean edge of his tunic, the faint scent of juniper from a recent bath, because that, too, was part of the story. That, too, was heroism, just with a slightly better smell. If you've ever stood in a hot shower, absent-mindedly massaging conditioner into your scalp while listening to a true crime podcast and thinking, I am at the peak of human civilization, you're not wrong. But you're also standing on the shoulders of giants, grimy, gritty, birch-scented giants with suspiciously good cheekbones and a surprising dedication to weekly baths. For all their war axes and epic poetry, the Vikings left behind a legacy that quietly reshaped how we think about cleanliness, personal care, and the delicate art of not smelling like a livestock barn on a humid day. It's easy to dismiss them as dirty barbarians. That's the brand they've been saddled with for centuria-shaggy raiders, crashing through monasteries, tracking mud across Europe, and yelling a lot. But under the blood and bravado was something more nuanced. These were people who valued grooming, who bathed regularly, who carried tweezers on their belts with the same reverence others reserved for knives. Their longships may have been powered by muscle and wind, but their society was held together by ritual, habit, and yes, a fair amount of soap. Well, soap. What they had was lye-based, ash-enriched, animal, fat, infused paste that could strip you of sin and skin in equal measure, but it worked. It cleaned bodies, combs, clothing, and possibly even the soul, depending on how long you left it on. They didn't dabble in citrus-scented body wash, but they knew that when you're living in close quarters with people, you do something. You scour, you scrape, you try. And trying, in Viking culture, meant more than just personal preference. It was social capital. A clean appearance was a mark of status, discipline, and respect. If you showed up to a gathering with your beard matted and your tunic crusted, you weren't just unpleasant, you were suspect. Cleanliness didn't guarantee honor, but it suggested you understood the rules of the game. And Viking life, for all its chaos, was deeply invested in rules. Their personal care toolkit was proof of this. Combs carved from bone, tweezers worn on chains, ear spoons, for reasons best not pictured in detail. These items weren't hidden away in private drawers. They were displayed, carried, used, and in some cases, buried with their owners, which tells us two things. 1. Grooming was portable. 2. If you went to Valhalla, you were not going greasy. And while the Vikings didn't invent personal hygiene, Egyptians, Romans, and other ancient peoples had their own complicated relationships with body care, they did something quietly radical. They normalized it. Not just for elites, not just for special occasions, but for regular people, on a regular basis, in a culture not particularly known for subtlety or softness. Laugardagra, washing day, was not just a break in the week. It was a system, a ritual, an expectation. Once a week, regardless of how many pigs had escaped, how many feuds were brewing, or how cold the river was, people got clean. They bathed, they scrubbed, they changed their clothes, at least some of them. It was communal, habitual, and more consistent than anything most of their continental contemporaries were doing. If you lived in a Frankish village and someone said, bath, it usually involved a bishop muttering disapproval or a vague memory of Roman ruins. But if you lived in a Norse settlement, the bathhouse was real. The steam was hot, and someone probably brought birch branches to slap against their skin because exfoliation and mild self-flagellation are historically inseparable. Now, before we get too misty-eyed, let's remember the downsides. Viking hygiene wasn't all minty freshness and neatly oiled braids. They lived with lice, fleas, and whatever else crawled in from the hay pile. Their homes were smoky, their diets fish-heavy, and their idea of waste management involved a bucket, a pit, and a stiff breeze. They scraped, combed, and rinsed, but they still lived in longhouses that could probably be smelled before they were seen. There's a reason the phrase, "smelled like a Viking," doesn't appear in any modern perfume ads. Their hygiene habits were impressive relative to the time. They didn't have toothbrushes, but they had picks and chewed birch twigs. They didn't have deodorant, but they bathed and used aromatic herbs. They didn't have washing machines, but they boiled water, scrubbed clothes, and made soap that could double as an industrial solvent. It wasn't about luxury. It was about making life slightly less intolerable in a world that was constantly trying to rot, freeze, or smoke you out. And it worked, for the most part. Archaeological digs in places like York, Dublin, and Birka have uncovered more than just jewelry and weapons. They've revealed grooming kits, personal combs, and the occasional perfectly preserved hairball of unknown origin. Some mysteries are best left unsolved. They've also found surprisingly well-preserved teeth testament to a diet low in sugar and a people who understood that food stuck between molars was more than just annoying, it was dangerous. And then there's the social layer. Cleanliness was a form of etiquette. Hosts provided guests with water and towels. Hair was combed before meals. Clothes were cleaned perhaps not daily, but often enough that a fresh tunic could mean the difference between welcome and suspicion. The sagas speak of people who were bright in appearance or well-groomed, and those descriptions weren't ornamental, they were shorthand for character. It's telling that when people wanted to show disrespect, they let themselves go. They skipped the bath. They showed up filthy. In a society that prized order amid chaos, presentation was part of the message. It wasn't just about looking good, it was about functioning in a community where status, trust, and reputation were everything. So what exactly did the Vikings get right? For one, consistency. They understood that cleanliness wasn't a special occasion, but a weekly act of survival, civility, and dare we say community bonding. For another, pragmatism. They used what they had, made it work, and didn't wait for ideal conditions. Cold river? Fine. Lye soap? That'll do. Bone comb? As long as it pulls lice out of my beard, we're in business. They also grasped, instinctively, the link between hygiene and identity. A clean person was a respectable person. A respectable person could trade, negotiate, propose marriage, or demand justice without someone wrinkling their nose halfway through the conversation. What did they leave behind that we're, let's say, less nostalgic about? Well, for one, the ear spoon. There are few items in human history so simultaneously practical and unsettling. It's not that we dislike the concept, it's the mental image that lingers, the unflinching boldness of carrying your own wax scraper on your hip. That's confidence most of us don't aspire to. Also, the soap. Effective. Absolutely. Pleasant? Only if your idea of a luxurious scent is burned log and regret. We're grateful for the evolution of scent profiles and for the eventual appearance of anything containing aloe, but still credit where it's due. They made something from nothing, and they didn't smell half as bad as people think. And then, of course, there's the chamber pot situation. Necessary, certainly. Elegant? Not so much. We're glad that particular legacy didn't stick around, though we should all take a moment to respect the fact that they managed sanitation with buckets, moss, and a prayer, while some modern humans still can't aim correctly in fully plumbed environments. In the grand story of human cleanliness, the Vikings occupy a curious place. Not the inventors, not the perfectionists, but the pragmatists, the let's at least try people. They bathed because they had to, groomed because it mattered, and wore tweezers because it worked. They understood that even in a world of blood feuds, shipwrecks, and seasonal starvation, it was worth combing your beard. And really, isn't that what legacy is all about? The little habits that make life bearable, the traditions that turn survival into something more, the way a simple weekly bath, a bone comb, and a bucket of boiling water can say, I'm still here, I care, I refuse to become a walking barn. So the next time you drag yourself to the shower, tired, cranky, and vaguely wondering if hygiene is even worth it, think of the Viking, standing shirtless in a river, lye soap in hand, scrubbing off the week while the wind tries to freeze his eyebrows. Not for glamour, not for Instagram, but because being clean, even just a little bit, was its own kind of victory. That, in the end, is their real legacy, the quiet, scrubbed defiance of people who refuse to let the dirt win, one bath at a time.